Hey there folks, I hope you're all well. So in this particular video we'll be making a lentil bolognese, and to accompany it in a separate video you'll find my bloomer bread. There's not much to say to it except that this is scrummy. It's again an uncomplicated dish. There's a few moving parts. You need to take your time, get each stage as you go, but otherwise it's an absolutely gorgeous meal. Great substitute for a meat bolognese, and I love it. Who'd have thunked it many years ago? Me? Never. Now, far nicer than any meat bolognese I've ever had. So, hopefully you give it a bash. Let's crack on and do it. So the very first thing we're looking to do is to prepare our lentils. Now you do have the option of using tinned lentils, and in that case it would be 2 cans. But I strongly advise you use the dried lentils, rehydrate them and cook them yourself. They give a far nicer mouthfeel than using tinned lentils. But if time constraints are a problem, because this does add nearly half an hour, then I can understand why you would prefer to use the tinned, but you get a much better dish if you use the dried. And we're looking for 350 grams of dried green lentil that we see here, and we're then going to take and we're going to rinse these under the sink to remove that whitey, dusty residue you can see sitting on them at the moment. Doesn't take long to rinse them, just showing you the ones that I use. They're a really nice green lentil. I get it from my Indian supermarket. But anyway, as I say, rinse them under your cold water. Doesn't take long, 30 seconds, minute at most, just removing the dusty residue, and then we're going to crack on, get them in a pot and get ready to cook them. And now that they are rinsed, we add them back to our pot and we're going to cover them in water. We're going to need a really good depth of water here, bare minimum twice the volume of lentils you have in your pan. Ideally as high as you can make it in your particular pan without it boiling over, because we may need to add even more water later on, because we're going to boil a lot of this water off as we cook them. From here we want to turn our heat up to high and bring the pan up to the boil, and we're then going to keep this at a rolling boil, and we're going to keep it going for 10 minutes. Once your 10 minutes at the boil is over, we want to reduce our heat, and we want this to remain at a simmer for 15 minutes. Don't let it get too cool, but we don't want the massive rolling boil we had either, so you might need to just adjust back and forward on your dial, but a medium sort of heat, and keep it at the simmer for 15 minutes. Now, whilst the lentils are cooking off, that gives us 25 minutes to prepare all our other ingredients, so you can save some of the time by not using the canned ones and by prepping the rest of your veg at this point. So first up is our onion, and as always with an onion, take off the top, half it down through the root, and then we're going to de-skin it. And as I show you in all my videos, I'll show you how to chop an onion just in case you don't know how to do it. Because, as I've said before, these videos are primarily aimed for people who were like me, who didn't have a clue when it came to cooking, who lived off pureed food, who were rubbish in the kitchen. So, let's crack on and show you how to chop an onion. And once de-skinned and halved, we're ready to start chopping up our onion. So first things first, we're looking to cut towards the root system without actually cutting through all the way to the root and slicing the onion apart. We're looking for almost fan type section to be formed. Once we've did that, we're going to cut perpendicular to the angle of cut we were, doing 90 degrees from where we are, and that's going to give us our rough chopped onion. Now, the size of the rough chops, or the size of the chops where you get finely chopped or rough chopped, is all down to and all determined by the size of the cuts that we made initially. So that's it. Let's crack on and we'll show you it from a different angle just so you get full clarity as to what I'm trying to say. So here we go from the different angle. Hopefully the top down will help clarify what I'm saying. We're cutting towards the root system without actually cutting through. The width of the cuts that we do here will determine whether we're going to be going for fine chopped onion or whether we're going for rough chopped. This sort of width here is a nice rough chop. If you're looking for a finer chop, you just decrease the size of the cuts we're doing. And the same with the 90 degree cuts, the perpendicular cuts to our original ones, help determine whether we're getting rough chop or whether we're getting fine chop. So hopefully that clarifies what I was saying. Let's crack on with the next stage. Before we actually do that, take all your onions and just transfer them into a large bowl, because we're going to store all our veg in one place prior to cooking. The next of our ingredients we're going to prepare is our carrot. First off, we're going to top and tail it, and by that I mean just take off the top and just take off the bottom. If it needs peeled, peel it. This is a really nice carrot, so it really doesn't need peeled. And then we're going to slice it down its entire length. And again, we're going to slice it down the two halves of their entire lengths. And from there, we're then going to cut it into sections roughly 6 to 8 millimeters apart, just by cutting perpendicular to the cuts that we just put in, as we see here. That's all it is. So let's chop that, and then we're going to store this in the same vase. I want to say vase, I don't mean vase. We're going to store this in the same bowl as our onions. And now we can prepare our celery. Now in this instance I'm using frozen celery, because whenever you buy celery from the supermarket there's always way too much for the actual recipe, the dish you're creating. So I always end up freezing my excess celery. It's a 3-minute blanch for your chopped pieces. Dry them and then freeze them in individual bags per stalk weight, which is about 70 to 80 grams per stalk. If you're using the fresh celery, chop it exactly the same way you would as a carrot. With our garlic, we are using either half a block of frozen crushed garlic or 2 cloves, 2 fresh cloves which we have chopped up. As I've explained before, I'm using this to show that it can be done. Is it just as flavoursome as fresh garlic? As I've said before, no it's not. But it's still very flavoursome. But for practical reasons, whether that be COVID, whether that be Brexit and hard to get a hold of stocks because stuff is harder to find in the supermarkets, that's the reason for using this. With our white mushrooms, we are looking to use 6 medium-large mushrooms, which comes in round about the 220-240 grams mark when it comes to actually weighing the mushrooms, if you'd rather do it that way. Now, most of the times when you chop mushrooms, you're chopping them into slices. However, as I mentioned previously, I had a lot of problems eating vegetables. I've got over those problems. One of the way I got over the problem of eating mushrooms was I actually chopping them up fully. So we take and we slice them as if we were slicing them for sticking on a pizza, say. And then we're going to, again, just like an onion, turn our knife and cut perpendicular in. I've actually found it gives a really nice spread of your mushroom sort of flavouring throughout your dish as well, rather than having the larger slices. It's optional if you want to stop at the slices, but it's well worth you trying it this way. I much prefer actually putting my mushrooms in this way, and it just spreads it throughout the dish better, as I say. Just like the onion, I'll also show you it from the top down angle, just for sake of clarity as to what I'm saying. So we take and we half our mushroom. After we've halved our mushroom, we're going to slice it just as if we were slicing for a pizza, as I've said, but then we're going to change the angle of our cut and we're going to cut perpendicular through at 90 degrees. And that gives us a really nice fine chunks which spread the flavour. And then all we want to do is take and transfer these to the same bowl that has all the rest of our vegetable ingredients. And by this point it's worth checking in on your lentils. As I mentioned earlier, if you're not careful they do have a tendency to run dry, so all we're going to do is add a little bit more water to this final simmer. There's only a couple of minutes left at this stage, but the water is getting down pretty low, so we're just going to add a little bit of boiled water just so that it doesn't run dry. And now that our 15 minutes of simmer is over, we can remove our lentils from the hob. And all we're going to do is drain them in a colander. Once we've got all the liquid out of them, we're going to then restore them back in the pan that we were cooking them in until we're ready to actually use them in the main dish. Just be careful when you've drained them into the colander over the top of your pan that you empty any extra drainage liquid out of the pan before finally putting them in it. I was going to have a giggle here about here's the hardest part, prepping our chopped tomatoes. But it turned out to be not as easy as it should have been because I broke the top off my can. As is wont to happen with these type of cans, that you occasionally break the top off. So, don't! And I had to go in with the tin opener and remove the top. When it comes to our red wine, any cheap supermarket own brand red wine will do. In this case I'm using one from Morrison's. It gives a really nice rounded flavour into the dish. It's one I like, it's the one I always seem to buy. It's cheap, it's cheerful and it does the job really well. and we're looking for 150 millilitres of this bottle of plonk. And to the wine we're going to add 100 millilitres of water, taking us to a total of 250 millilitres. If you don't want to use the wine, you could substitute for stock instead, and in that case it'll be 250 millilitres of stock, but the wine really adds to it. Next up is our tomato paste, tomato puree, whichever way you prefer to call it. We're looking for 75 grams of tomato puree. I tend to just like to measure this out onto the scale, so I've got the exact measurement, but you can use 4 tablespoons, which although not exactly 75 grams, is close enough. It's give or take a gram or so. So either 75 grams weighed directly or 4 tablespoons is what we're looking for. And now it's just our herbs and seasoning, and then we'll be ready to cook. So we are looking for 1 teaspoon of dried mixed herbs. It does go a long way, this dish. I mean, we're talking 6 portions, so we're looking for 2 teaspoons of salt in this particular one. Last but not least, our final ingredient before we're ready to cook is half a teaspoon of black pepper. To either a large saute pan as we see here, or any other heavy based large pan of this sort of nature that you own, we're going to add 3 tablespoons of vegetable oil, and we're going to bring that up to heat. Set your hob to medium high, give it a 2 or 3 minutes to let the oil get up to temperature. We're looking for the shimmer in the oil. Once we've got the shimmer in the oil, we can add our vegetables and start cooking. And to start off with, we're going to add the entirety of our vegetable mixture, and we're going to continue to cook this at a medium-high heat for 6 minutes. And periodically, as the vegetables cook, just give them a little bit of a stir, just to make sure everything's mixed through thoroughly and everything's getting an even cook. And now we can add the rest of our ingredients. That's the red wine, the water, chopped tomatoes, tomato puree, the herbs, and the seasoning. We're then looking to bring everything back up to the boil. Once the boil has been achieved, turn your temperature back down to medium, and we're going to cook this for 15 minutes. We're going to stir it, but we don't need to be doing it all the time, so relatively infrequently. We're just looking to prevent any of the dish sticking to the bottom of the pan, which means as we get closer to the 15 minutes being up, pay more attention to the stirring, because that's when you're more likely to find it sticking, because more of your liquid will have evaporated by that point. But 15 minutes stirring infrequently at a medium temperature after the boil. And once your 15 minutes simmer is over, we're going to take and we're going to add the lentils that we've reserved from our preparation earlier, and we're going to cook this at the same temperature for 7 minutes, just until we get the heat all the way back through the lentils and everything's nice and hot and ready to serve. Now at this stage, this is where we really do need to stir it, so we're going to be stirring a lot more frequently than we were on the previous stage. Again, we're looking for this to thicken up and dry down, and because we're looking for it to thicken up and dry down, that's really where we have a much larger risk of things sticking or things potentially even burning on the bottom of the pan. So give everything a really good mix together, and then keep a good eye on it and stir quite frequently over these last 7 minutes. And as soon as those 7 minutes are over, we can then remove it from the heat, ready to serve. And as this makes 6 portions, divide it up evenly. We're having 3 portions in this meal, and we're putting 3 aside for another meal. Once you've served them all up, we're going to then garnish them with lashings, and I do mean lashings of Parmesan-style cheese, because why scrimp on it? It adds so much to the overall flavour and the overall experience of eating the meal. There we go, folks. 1 lentil bolognese. Can we get it in shot? Yes, we can. With lashings of Parmesan-style cheese. Let's get a wee mouthful. I know you're probably getting sick of me saying this, but this is going to be another gorgeous one. And it is. It really, really is. I came, as I've told you before, from eating almost nothing. I certainly wouldn't touch vegetables, no matter what you'd have paid me. This far is so superior to any meat-based bolognese I've ever had. There's just so much flavour throughout it. Please, go make it. So, I'll off to have my dinner. Stay safe folks, all the best.